talked with you, listening to you did a radio gig actually on a drive home from Vegas. And one thing that really struck me is you made a point about trying to avoid the gravitational pull of industry rankings. You don't look at rankings from other people, and I'm the same way. And I think it's really important that you try to at least you find the source, at least from on our side of things. I would think elsewhere too that you don't get that paralysis by analysis, thinking like, oh, what have I forgotten? What do they have? I mean, yes, you miss out on an occasional guy here and there because of that, but more often than not, you put all the time in. If you've done all the research, don't have like 18 different sets of rankings and generalize it.
Yeah, there's two schools of thoughts. Two schools of thought. My rankings are based on the facts, right? I do my rankings based on the information that I'm reading and absorbing and observing, and I put that together into a ranking. So that's my opinion based on facts. If I see a whole bunch of other people's opinion, that's not based on facts. The only fact that's based on is what other people think. It's not based on how big is this guy, how fast is this guy, how productive was he, how was the offensive line last year, what are the changes in the offseason. Those are all factual bases for evaluating players. So-and-so think these three people who I respect have this guy ranked lower than I do is not really a factual basis. It's a opinion basis. So that's the danger, right? But then the other school of thought is wisdom of crowds. You got 10 experts. On average, they're going to beat one expert. So why am I, bothering to worry about, if my ranking's way out of line with the consensus, then my interpretation of the facts is very different from theirs, or I'm missing a fact. And so, it is useful to say, is there a fact that I'm not aware of? Am I missing a fact? Is there another player there that I'm not aware of? If that's the case, then that ranking, then it would be helpful to read their stuff. But the problem is, it's not helpful if the reason you differ is we just have a different interpretation of the facts. Because even if there's 10 of them and one of me, who's to say that theirs is better than mine? Now, there is the wisdom of the crowds thing, which happens sometimes, but then often the crowd is wrong. There's times when the crowd is wrong. Not often, but there's times when they're wrong. And it's not like my rankings are going to be totally, I'm not going to have LaShawn McCoy as the 12th running back. There's no chance of that. So, the differences we have with people might be because we have it right as often as because we have it wrong. And so it's very hard to look at 10 other people's rankings that differ from yours and not be affected in some way by that pull toward maybe I'll just bump this guy down a little bit because I was too high on him.
Sure, of course. And if we buy into the wisdom of crowds, why be in business? That's the whole point. We're in business because we think we know what we're talking about. We think we know something more than the field. So that's why we're promoting our rankings, promoting our insight, promoting our analysis. So of course we're going to look at it from that vantage point. So, all right.
Wait, I want to add to something. And then let's just say, okay, that my rankings of somebody, I'm very high on certain guys and very low on certain guys. So let's just take an example. I am pretty low on Marshawn Lynch. I'm pretty low on Matthew Stafford, right? And let's just say I'm wrong in those cases because either I'm interpreting the facts in a way that's that's wrong, or I'm missing a particular fact. I think the latter case is a much better way to be wrong than missing something, right? So you made a wrong call. I still think it's better for your overall rankings to be wrong and avoid looking at the other people's rankings, to be wrong on one or two things, than to start seeding your own faith and your own observations, and then all your rankings just kind of are a murky variation of the consensus. That's what I think can happen if you get too worried about, oh, I'm an outlier here. You know what? Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, that's fine. I'm going to have to live with that. I'd rather live with – I think sometimes – being right in this small way, being more right about this one outlier, is actually overall detrimental to your long-term ability to be right generally, because even though you've maybe made this adjustment that makes that one player slightly more accurate, you're starting to cede the trust and faith in your own observations. And once that's gone, you're lost. You have nothing. And then you may as well just be somebody who does, the ADP, and you're a total agnostic, and you just pick whichever guy seems to fall lowest below ADP, and you never reach. And that's your method of drafting, because that's all you got left, because you no longer have any sort of real faith in your own judgment calls. And it's hard to maintain faith because who are you against 10 other guys or the industry consensus? But, there's no point in doing it otherwise. You may as well just have the computer auto draft for you, and just invest money in the algorithm.
Indeed, and if you do that, then you shouldn't even bother being playing, because there's going to be 5 other guys that can do that in every single league. Not that there are 5 guys in every single one of our leagues that play that way, but there are plenty of guys that do just go by ADP or go by consensus thought. So the idea is, how do we separate ourselves from the consensus? Like you said, you search for this particular facts. you try to live. You're almost in a bubble right now, and trying just to research every fact you possibly can without trying to look at opinion. It's a weird place to be in right now. And the problem with this also is there's some good opinion out in the industry I'd like to read, but
sorry, finish the sentence. I'm not against coming across debate and opinion. Like, so on Twitter, you hear, I get into arguments with people about guys, right? And I'll be like, I don't agree with that. I have this guy here. And I'm interested to hear what they have to say. Almost all the time, everything they have to say is something I've considered and rejected, right? It's not like some new thing I didn't realize. Now, if they come up with something new that I didn't realize, I may have to change my mind, right? They may be right about something if I didn't realize a fact about a player. But I'll give you an example with Stafford. I have him at 9th among quarterbacks. A lot of people have him at 4th. A lot of people have him at 5th. And they think, look, he's got Golden Tate now. They've got Eric Ebron. They got Joe Lombardi, the Saints coordinator. They're going to spread it around. They're going to get finally the complement to Calvin Johnson they need. And that sounds great. But the reality is Scott Linehan called 704 pass plays or whatever it was a couple years ago, and 650 something last year, and he has the most, the 4th most, and the 17th most attempts ever for a quarterback the last 3 years. And Stafford, basically what he did was just chuck it downfield to Calvin Johnson. Now, you ask him to do what Drew Brees does and spread it around to a whole bunch of different weapons. Is he good enough to do that? Can he go through his progressions? Can he find the open guy? Or with a guy with a big arm who's kind of mistake-prone, is it better to just get, for fantasy especially, to have 700 attempts, 200 of which go to the best receiver perhaps in the history of the NFL, and then just get whatever happens then? So I think this could be a disaster for Stafford, personally. People think it's good that a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator is coming in. So, we're both aware of the facts. I just disagree with how to interpret them. And I think that's where the edge comes, is we're all share basically the same facts, and we weigh them differently. And so, this whole thing about big data, there's going to be data and you can crunch numbers and stuff. Well, it's knowing how to crunch the numbers in your head. It's not even crunching numbers so much as weighing different factors into an aggregate ranking. And we're all going to do that slightly differently.
Isn't it also true that one of the problems we run into is that what's best for the Lions and for Stafford isn't best for us necessarily? It may be better for the Lions too, for Stafford to continue checking it to Calvin, but they're bringing in a change of coordinators, they're bringing in change of personnel in order to stop the chuck and duck interception, the high interception totals, the mistakes that he's made over the years, trying to make him more efficient. But it may not be something that the end result works best for us too. So that's also part of the calculus. Is we've got our mindset of, okay, he might make him a better quarterback, but that might not help us.
Right, and I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. Is he put up good fantasy numbers the last few years? Calvin Johnson put up great fantasy numbers, and the Lions were not very good. And they're thinking, you know what? To be a better offense, we're going to have to spread this around. We're going to have to show Matt Stafford how to run an offense, not just chuck the ball to your best guy. And I'm not sure Stafford's capable of doing that, but they at least have to find out, right? Because they're not going to advance unless their defense suddenly becomes the 2000 Ravens. They're not going to advance very far or even make the playoffs unless they can develop some different ways of spreading the field out and really exploiting the fact that Johnson's double and triple teamed and getting production to a second receiver. I don't know that they're going to succeed in doing that, but they have to try. If I'm a Stafford owner, I don't really want them to be doing that. I want them to chuck the ball to Calvin Johnson as much as possible and let him make huge plays. I don't care if there's interceptions. It doesn't bother me as a Stafford owner. It only bothers you as a Lions fan or a Lions part of Lions management. So I think that's true. I think that's exactly what's happening.
Looking at the alternatives they brought in, we've spent some time talking about Eric Ebron, our wariness of drafting rookie tight ends. What about Golden Tate? Are you going to have him in your profile this year?
In my portfolio?
Portfolio, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No Golden Tate in my Twitter profile or my or any other profile that I have. But maybe who knows? If I meet him somewhere, I may take a picture with him. Who knows? But I don't think so. I think he's being he's a good player. He's kind of explosive, and he's not huge, but he's kind of stout, and he's fast, and he makes big plays. And maybe Stafford gets the ball to him, he gets 90 targets or 100 targets and catches 60, 70 balls and gets 8 touchdowns. I mean, I think he can be useful. I don't see myself really targeting him. If Calvin goes down, I don't see that offense even being very good. So it's not like, Golden Tate, he would get more targets, obviously. But I'm not convinced that would be, he would be anything close to replacing him as even a number one. I'm not even sure that he would be able to take on that role and really handle it. So no. I'm probably not doing that. I want to say one other thing, because you asked the question earlier. You said, where do we get our edge, now that there's all these good consensus rankings, and people can do this. And I said one is how we interpret the data. Okay, fine. But I think that there's a really big way to get an edge, especially in this. And football is not as developed as baseball. I think this may apply even more to baseball, but also to football. Is in the sort of era of big data and algorithms and number crunching, all these factors, and you have all these articles on good sites like RotoViz coming out like, well, the ideal running back is 4.5, sub 4.5, and the receivers are 6'3", 220, and they can run a 4.55 or less. And there's all these sort of parameters, right? And all that stuff is true to an extent. It's true for the most part. And so you start getting these trends, and we start understanding, these different strategies. But I think that you always find value and get really ahead where something's true in some conditions that usually obtain, but it's not true in other conditions. And you have to find out where the conditions aren't the case, aren't the same. And I'll give you an example. There's a lot of examples, but people say, well,
okay,
if you were to say a guy who's 6'9", 260, how does he get 6 assists a game in the NBA? That just doesn't happen. Well, unless he's LeBron James. Like unless the conditions, who the player is totally different, then he doesn't fit into this block that's similar. A lot of things are true. I mean, you look at the way in physics, the way things behave. Newton's laws. Those are all true, except that as things get toward the speed of light, it's totally not true, right? When the conditions are totally different, then the truisms that we think are just true always are actually not true. And sometimes conditions change quickly, or you don't realize how conditions have changed. You don't know how a team's offensive line has suddenly improved, or you don't know how conditions are different. And betting on the uncertainty that we don't know the conditions, or this is true only under certain circumstances that this is true, and it's taken to be true all the time, and then things change, and then there's a huge amount of value to be had because you're already, you realize that this fact that was brought up, the so-called fact, was only true in a certain subset of conditions that don't always obtain. They just happen to obtain the last 2 years or the last season.
So tell me one of those conditions. Well, let's reach from the grave and find out one of these conditions.
Well, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't necessarily have anything, like, okay, well.
Oh, what a build-up. It's just like
well,
our titles.
No, I'm saying
so
this
misleading.
It's just like our titles. This is the framework, though, I think, and I'm not maybe explaining as well as I possibly could, but that a lot of things are true under one set of circumstances, but if those circumstances were to change, it would be totally untrue. And I don't know. I'll think about it as we do more of this video, if I can come up with a specific thing. It comes up all the time. I mean, the most common example is like, Salfino the other day, he said C.J. Spiller is not just simply clear. He said he's clearly not built to play in the NFL. I said, why? Because he sprained his ankle? And he said, no, because his BMI, his body mass index is, whatever. He's not very stout for his height, basically. He's like 5'11", 200, right? You could be 5'6", 200, and you have a high body mass index, or 6 feet, 230. To him, that's running back. That's a durable running back. If you're taller and thinner, 5'11", 200, you don't have that, right? So under many conditions, I'm sure he's done some research and found out that typically running backs like that aren't especially good, although I can think Jamal Charles, Chris Johnson, a couple skinnier guys have been very, very good, work done, but let's just say generally those are the exceptions. Then the question is, okay, so it's
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's interesting that you and Mike, and I'm probably overstepping for Mike, but you seem to take different approaches. Mike tries to find unifying trends and to simplify matters, to try to not necessarily make it one size fits all, but at the same time say, well, if these conditions are true, then you can follow this. Whereas you'll tend to be looking for the exception to each of these rules more often than not. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think what happens is those rules are good and useful, and he's doing a service by putting those out there because he's telling people, look, here's like an easy rule of thumb to separate who's more likely to be healthy and who's more likely to get hurt, right? And here's an easy rule of thumb to, big receivers score more touchdowns. That's a good rule of thumb. But when you had Steve Smith, who was 5'9", whatever, in his prime, 5'9", 190 in his prime, 1 year he scored 12. He was never a consistent touchdown scorer. Or you have Desean Jackson, these guys with huge speed and crazy moves. They're still not as consistent of a bet for touchdowns because they're not red zone guys, but they can still be top receivers, right? Now, you can't take them up where you're going to take a size speed guy, but I could see I'm going to take Desean Jackson probably ahead of Larry Fitzgerald this year, even though Larry Fitzgerald's bigger, Desean Jackson's so much faster. So there's, anytime you have and there could be a receiver that comes in who's small, but he's so amazing that forget about it. Forget about how small he is. He can get 15 touchdowns. There could be. I don't know that there is one now. But I just think we want to know the rules. But then once everybody knows the rules, because the rules are not that, they're easy to understand. Once the Salfinos and these other people do the research and they put these rules out there and people start adopting these rules, then the value is always going to be in finding out who's the exception, who's the small guy that I can buy for small guy value that's going to give me big guy production, or there's tons of rules like that, and that's to me where you can get your edge, especially in 2014 fantasy football. We're not talking about people are new to this. People know what the hell they're doing now.
Right, exactly. Now, taking that one individual rule, the big receiver rule, we earlier talked about Tavon Austin and how there's a possibility that he could be a pretty good bargain this year. I want to kind of specifically break down one player. I know we like to cover the general trends, but let's go player analysis here just a little bit here. Look at Tavon Austin. Can he overcome the organizational context of Sam Bradford being the quarterback, perhaps having a bad offensive line, Brian Schottenheimer being the coordinator? Can he overcome all that to become a valuable fantasy commodity this year? What's the likelihood of it?
What's the likelihood of you putting a refrigerator on your back and climbing Mount Everest by yourself? No, he's got a
I'm working out. What do you think? Come on. I can do this.
He's got a little better chance than that, but there's so many negatives. Sam Bradford sucks. I'm sorry. I mean, what, was he going to just break out in year 6, year 5, whatever it is now?
You need to learn how to not mince words. You're just way too obtuse here.
I mean, Tom Kesenick, our buddy at NFFC, believes in Sam Bradford. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong, but from everything I've seen, he's just not that good. Okay, 2. There are a lot of mouths to feed in that offense. It could be Kenny Britt, it could be Jared Cook, it could be Chris Givens, who was actually very good his rookie year. And they have a whole bunch of running backs. Zach Stacy, Benny Cunningham was good last year. Trey Mason, they just drafted. It's just crowded there. And they're in the NFC West. They play the Niners twice, the Cardinals twice, and the Seahawks twice. Now, here's the case for Austin. Second year is when receivers break out. That's good. He's a second-year receiver. 2, there was a game or two where he had monster games. He touched the ball like 3 times, got a touchdown, kick return, running touchdown, and receiving touchdown, huge ones, like 80-yard touchdowns against the Colts. Obviously, the explosiveness, it's as advertised. He has it. And if they can get him the ball 100 times, he's going to get a bunch of those. And if he runs and returns a couple for a touchdown, that's going to even be better. And against those great defenses, maybe that's the guy you have to deploy. Maybe the sort of straight, pocket passing, out routes, go route, the regular routes for regular people are not going to work. You send a big receiver like Kenny Britt out against Richard Sherman, who's also big and physical, maybe it doesn't work. But I don't think Richard Sherman or anyone else can keep up with Tavon Austin in the open field. The 6'3" corners who've been brought in to counter the bigger receivers, they're not as quick as someone like Austin. But I think it's still slim. You look at guys like Devin Hester, who's maybe the greatest kick returner of all time, couldn't make it as a receiver. They just couldn't find a way to feed him the ball. Dante Hall and the Chiefs before that, they tried to use him. He was a great returner as a receiver. It's those little guys. You look at, what's the guy in the Bengals, Andrew Hawkins, so fast, so quick, but I mean, how involved really is he?
Right. And now he's a Brown, so it's even worse.
Oh, he's not even on, right. That's right. He's on the Browns now. That's great. So, and Brad Evans is like, oh, Hawkins, that's the guy to look at the Browns now that Josh on, and Miles Austin's kind of a scrub at this point. Maybe it is. Maybe he would be good, but those little tiny receivers, the only one I can think of that really gets the ball and has been a productive receiver is Desean Jackson. Steve Smith was stronger and more physical. Desean Jackson is 5'9", 180, 175, and skinny. He's not physical. He's not big and strong, but he's so fast.
As far as we know, he hasn't beaten up a teammate in the film room just yet, so he's got to work on that part of his game.
Yeah, a running back. He hasn't beat up a running back. It's one thing if you beat up the kicker, but beating up a big running back like Steven Davis, that's saying something. So, yeah, it's rare. So I think there's a chance. Obviously, I don't, and there's a point at which I would take him, but he probably won't be in my portfolio or in my profile picture either.
No. And that's a good stopping point for here. We'll talk about more anomalies, some guys to kind of separate yourself from the crowd next time we do this. Thanks for watching RotoWire TV.